And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I wanted to let you know I'm zooming in from the West Coast in Seattle, where the UW sits, University of Washington, and to let you know that our institution is on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples. And I want to acknowledge the work we do, our studying, teaching, our thinking would neither be possible or as inspired without the stunning land, waters, and the other than human kin that surround and support us. The Jackson School of International Studies, where Canadian Studies is, understands that our international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations people, Métis, Inuit, and Indigenous nations across the world. So I'm delighted to welcome you today to our first lecture as part of our series, Arctic Environments. As we all know, as the Arctic is warming, it's destroying the natural environment and challenging social life, and how we understand and approach those issues has never been more critical. So I really want to thank Professor Jonathan Payton for bringing together his colleagues to address these issues. And Jonathan is our current UW Fulbright Chair in Arctic Studies, the chair supported by Global Affairs, College of the Environment, the Divisional Dean of Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences, the Jackson School of International Studies, and also in the College of Arts and Sciences. So with that, Jonathan, I'll turn this over to you to introduce our first guest.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Nadine. It's a real pleasure to invite Phil, Dr. Phil Wight, to join us from Fairbanks, Alaska, where I think you are right now, Phil. Yeah. To kick off our series on Arctic environments. The goal of this series is to develop Arctic environments as a question, to invite people from different disciplines to think about how their discipline approaches the Arctic environment as a question, or Arctic environments plural as a question. So Phil is going to kick us off with his talk today on war and energy, mobilizing the Arctic environment, 1938 to 1968. Phil is an assistant professor in history and in Arctic and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska, where he works primarily on the history of energy, with a focus more generally on infrastructure, mobility, and the history of climate change, the history and the contemporary aspects of climate change. Phil is, we're really excited to have you here, Phil. As Nadine suggested, this series is sponsored by a whole bunch of people, but most importantly, this series is sponsored by the students right in front of me from Arctic 401. They're all waving at you. You can't see them right now. They're sitting there. They actually are waving after I said that. This invitation is from me, but it is also from the students of 401. Phil has a ton of stuff forthcoming, book chapters on the atomic home front to the US military and nuclear energy in the Alaska Pacific, journal article in the Journal of Energy History to go alongside book chapters in the Greater Plains, rethinking a region's environmental history, and a book chapter in the Cambridge history of the polar regions, along with his still being worked up book manuscript that we're all waiting with bated breath for. The most important thing Phil has done recently was to be a subject matter expert, and this will prove his bona fides to us in this class, at least, a subject matter expert for National Geographic's battle for Alaska's oil. And this relates directly to what I think is a really important aspect of Phil's work, which is his commitment to advocacy that is present in his historical work, but also in thinking about the realities of climate change in Alaska and beyond, and his commitment to a just transition. Maybe you'll be talking a little bit about that today, Bill, as well, as you dive into the history of Alaska's wartime environment and the environments that it produced. So we'll pass the floor to you, Phil.
Well, thank you, Dr. Payton, for that very, very warm welcome. And thanks to the Jackson Center for the invitation today. I really appreciate it. I am here in Fairbanks. It feels like a fortuitous environment to be discussing this topic. It is a beautiful and blistery snowy day outside. And the lights in my office kind of interfere with my camera, so I've turned off the lights. So it's a little dark, it's snowy, perfect for a conversation about the Arctic right now. And maybe I'll just say a couple words before I kind of dive into my narrative here. So, as an environmental historian, I understand the Arctic environment through studying the most powerful and influential organization, I would argue, in the North American Arctic, which is the U.S. military. And more precisely, the U.S. military, especially in its kind of early days of Arctic exploration and development, really failed to understand the Arctic environment, right? So maybe this gets us kicked off properly for Dr. Stoll's talk in the coming weeks about ignorance, right? The production of ignorance. And I should also say that I'm not a military historian, right? I didn't get into this to study the U.S. military. I'm very much an environmental historian, very much focused on energy. And I never expected to be studying the US military in the Arctic, but as an energy and environmental historian focusing on Alaska, one cannot understand Alaska and the Arctic environment without understanding the influence and the agency of the US military. And there are many direct connections to climate change here. Which I'll, hopefully become apparent to you as we go throughout the talk. As Dr. Payton mentioned, some of my work also deals with just transition and advocacy. I won't be dealing with that as directly here, but there's a number of tangible connections. And in fact, where I end would be a great opportunity to talk about the recently approved Willow project, right? And to understand the deeper history of where that project is coming from. So with that said, let me jump into an evocative moment in January 1945 that brings some of these dynamics to life. Let me just share my screen here. Just a moment. All right, are we good to go? Excellent. So, place to begin here. The winds howled as the members of the 1st Combat Intelligence Platoon mushed their huskies through the darkness of an Arctic January day. Temperatures reached negative 43 degrees Celsius as the men scouted the river valleys and mountain passes of Alaska's Brooks Range. This was no ordinary mission. And these men were no regular infantry. The platoon, comprised of soldiers from the Alaska Territorial Guard, a military reserve force of Alaska Natives, colloquially known as the Eskimo Scouts, was the vanguard of the first survey of a petroleum pipeline from Alaska's North Slope. In the early winter of 1945, 3 ATG patrols spearheaded a survey of a potential pipeline route from Livengood, north of Fairbanks, to Umiat on the North Slope of Alaska. The men traveled over 3,200 kilometers by dog sled in the middle of Arctic winter, battling snow deeper than a meter. Here was a moment that traditional Indigenous travel skills and knowledge proved indispensable for the American war effort and the exploration of Arctic petroleum. The ATG members achieved their objective and laid out a feasible pipeline route for the military's petroleum needs. These men were vital for the Navy's petroleum explorations, yet just one small part of the military's unprecedented intervention in the North American Arctic. And this map that you see here is very likely the first map of a proposed Trans-Alaska pipeline. Comes from 1946. And this was the route that these native individuals were helping to scout, partially because the military did not have the environmental expertise to do it themselves. And so the ATG's 1944-1945 pipeline survey offers a suggestive window into the hidden and unwritten histories of North American Arctic petroleum exploration. And the contribution of these Alaska Native soldiers in ground truthing, this first pipeline survey, is almost unknown in Alaska today, despite the centrality of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System to the state's contemporary political economy. For decades after this survey, private industry, including the owners of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, used this Native-led survey and related geophysical oil explorations to advance the construction of an Arctic artery. So scholars often use the Prudhoe Bay oil strike of 1968 and the TAPS controversy as shorthand for the beginning of the Arctic oil era. But these developments were the culmination of several decades of intensive military exploration, state-sponsored scientific research, and the construction of novel oil pipelines in the far north. So this brings me to kind of some of my big picture points that I want to make today, right? My arguments here. And so the first argument is really that the exigencies of World War II and the Cold War compelled the U.S. and Canadian federal governments to transform the American Arctic into ground zero for petroleum innovation and production. And so specifically on the timing front, I think many scholars have adequately traced the militarization of the Arctic to the Cold War. But this presentation, as this presentation will hopefully demonstrate, I argue this process really began with extensive military and petroleum operations during World War II, right? Classic environmental historians argument, right? It always happens sooner, right? It's earlier than most people have recognized it. The second part of this is that the state, especially through its military organizations, was the prime mover in the exploration and development of Arctic oil. In North America, this is not often the story that's told, certainly not in Alaska. While private industry made important contributions, scholars must recognize the militarized nature of what historian Paul Sabin evocatively called the hydrocarbon frontier. Between the 1920s and 1950s, US and Canadian federal governments explored and proved out a vast swath of Arctic North America, stretching from northwestern Alaska to the Mackenzie River Delta. The nature of the North invited robust state intervention, far from established markets, extraordinarily expensive, and offering daunting environmental challenges. Northern development demanded a unique set of resources, which made the military uniquely suitable. Deep pockets, a wartime social license, the application of cutting-edge science and technology, and the ability to construct novel Arctic infrastructures without earning a return on investment. In addition to confirming the existence of large oil and gas reserves in the regions, the US military also constructed the first two Arctic-grade petroleum pipeline systems. So innovating and constructing these petroleum transportation systems proved the key to developing hydrocarbons in the North American Arctic. In other areas of the world, really, it's all about finding the oil. In Alaska and the far north, transportation is the key. And so while state power proved necessary to overcome the nature of the far north, its frenetic exploration and development of oil left an enduring and indelible impression upon the Arctic environment. Military petroleum efforts helped to awaken burgeoning environmental movements to the hazards of Arctic oil development decades before the development or the discovery of the continent's largest oil field at Prudhoe Bay in 1968. So we'll go to this photo. This is picture from the Canal project, which I'm going to talk a lot about in this presentation, the first of these Arctic, petroleum infrastructures. And so the second major argument that I want to advance here is that Northern hydrocarbon development was an international project, which sprawled beyond the political boundaries and was bound up with the imbricated nature of widespread military infrastructure projects during the war. During the emergency of the Second World War, the United States and Canada constructed the Northwest Staging Route, which was a string of airfields, basically from Montana through Alaska, as well as the very famous Alaska-Canada Highway, which I'll just call the ALCAN, And these were petroleum thirsty infrastructures that necessitated building the first Arctic grade petroleum supply chain in the far north, the Canal pipeline system. And historians have often treated these developments as separate endeavors, but I would argue that these projects must be viewed holistically. And so to this end, the Northwest Staging Route, the Alcan and the Canal projects are talked about herein as a singular mega project, what I call the Northwest Defense Complex. And at its core, the Northwest Defense Complex constituted a sprawling transportation infrastructure for moving military aircraft and petroleum to and through Northwestern America. The complex transformed the region, resulting in the first Far North Petroleum Pipeline. It spurred the U.S. Navy to explore for Alaskan oil between 1943 and 1953, and it paved the way for all of these other petroleum infrastructures throughout the region, which have left, this enduring environmental legacy. And so only through seeing kind of the far-reaching nature of these projects can we understand their expansive legacy. And so finally, what I want to argue here is the realization of what we might call this militarized hydrocarbon frontier was not simply about national security or defense. It was really about how state power would transform these regions for peacetime commercial use, right? And this is the direct connection to things like the Willow Project today. While both the United States and Canadian state adopted various policies oscillating between inducing private investment and reserving promising areas for state-directed production, ultimately, both governments played an outsized role in encouraging private oil production. Beginning in the 1920s and culminating between 1942 and 1953, the U.S. military provided the spade work, to use historian Megan Black's evocative term, that fueled private oil exploration throughout the region and helped to define the ultimate route for a pipeline from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, right? The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, arguably the most expensive private capital project in world history. Land surveys, exploration drilling, and the expulsion of an Inuit and Inupiat from ancestral lands helped to incorporate territory for development and, quote, twist the earth into a template for capitalist activity. Again, according to Black. The state-funded private oil companies, such as Standard Oil of California and Imperial Oil, to explore the Arctic, they provided them with surplus equipment. The state turned over pertinent geophysical records, offered to sell them oil from restricted government reserves, and conveyed valuable lessons learned in Arctic pipeline construction. So this kind of robust federal and military support was a leading way, to use historian Paul Sabin's terminology, that petroleum abundance was, quote, made as much as discovered, end quote. So I want to tell this story in 3 acts. And the first act is going to be all about the Northwest Defense Complex. And I should admit, I have a large number of maps in this presentation, and I was a little hesitant about that. And then I remembered that Dr. Payton invited me, and he loves a good map. So I'm going to kind of put on my quasi-geographer map here. And the content for this presentation in this map actually comes from a chapter that I wrote in the Cambridge History of the Polar Regions. The citation here is on the right. And what this map actually shows is the overlap of all of these different petroleum infrastructures from World War II through the Cold War, basically up to the present, right? With the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. It doesn't deal with contemporary petroleum infrastructures in northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories, but it's really thinking about the historical accumulation of these infrastructures. And the subtext behind all of this is that the federal government and the military needed to master or to have a kind of understanding of the natural environment in order to build these infrastructures. And then these infrastructures exerted a profound weight upon the natural environment and continue to do so both directly and through climate change, with the acidifications of the ocean, and the atmosphere and all of those vast geophysical processes which continue to unfold. So World War II precipitated a flurry of defense projects in the far north. With seemingly limitless funds, the Army and its cost-plus civilian contractors built thousands of miles of roads and pipelines, constructed dozens of new airstrips, and drilled hundreds of new oil wells throughout northwestern North America. While public and amateur historians often focus on the famous Alcan Highway, this was actually the least important project for wartime needs. The US military constructed the highway primarily as a supply route for connecting a string of airfields, this northwest staging route. And in the chaotic early days of the war, military planners really scrambled to devise an adequate petroleum supply chain to fuel both the highway and the string of airfields. And originally, by the way, the highway, the Alaska Military Highway, was so-called the oil can highway because they're pitching so many cans of oil because it required vast quantities of oil to bring up men and material and build the infrastructure. So there's a great quote by Navy Commander John C. Reed, who's a fascinating individual in his own right. And he explored the Arctic for oil during and after the war. And he recalled of World War II, quote, "This was a different kind of war, mechanized beyond previous imagination and requiring almost unbelievable quantities of petroleum products," end quote. So how the military delivered the fuel mattered enormously for the war effort, local peoples, the subarctic environment, and the future of Northern development. And this is another great slide that really shows the extent of wartime development during the Second World War in Alaska. And, it's no surprise that historians often say that the rate of change during wartime is equivalent to what would take one or, multiple generations during peacetime, right? Most people in Alaska today have very little understanding that, something like half the state was built during the Second World War. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but when you add up all the infrastructures, there's quite a large amount of infrastructure that stemmed directly from the Second World War. So it was only when Canadian explorer Wilhelmer Stephenson urged consideration of Norman Wells, and I'll go back to this map here, only when he suggested Norman Wells as a place where the US military might get oil, that this idea of the canal pipeline really began to take shape. And pipelines were kind of the time-tested way to move oil overland ever since 1878, when the technology of long-distance pipelines was innovated in Pennsylvania, coming out of the oil regions there. And with enemies closing in on all fronts, military officials envisioned the canal system as a kind of unsinkable oil tanker that could fuel Fortress North America through the crucible of total war. They were very concerned that Japanese submarines would cut off supplies from the American West Coast, and Alaska and Northwest Canada would be isolated. So in April 1942, in a cabinet meeting, President Roosevelt emphasized the importance of securing local oil resources for the defense of Alaska and argued the military should spearhead the development of petroleum resources. So later that month, the US War Department approves the first phase of this canal pipeline system from Norman Wells to Whitehorse, Yukon. Following the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians, military officials sped up this construction, merging soldiers and contractors to expedite the construction of both the highway and the canal system. At the peak of construction in 1943, over 60,000 American and Canadian workers, both military folks and civilians, were employed in constructing the Northwest Defense Complex from Edmonton to Norman Wells, Dawson Creek to Fairbanks. These men constituted a, quote, army of occupation, end quote, according to two historians of the far north. And this, this group of folks far outnumbered local peoples in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And this is also a great map that actually comes from a U.S. Army Cold Regions laboratory in 1977, trying to understand the impact of the canal system. And it really shows you the different lines. There ended up being 1,600 miles of pipeline, a crude oil pipeline from Norman Wells to Whitehorse. And then the idea was they would refine the crude oil and they would send it to places like Watson Lake and Fairbanks. Didn't fully work out the way that they had intended it, but I'll talk about that here in a moment. And so to supply this pipeline, the Allied forces needed adequate quantities of petroleum. So the War Department actually paid for and approved an escalating wildcat drilling campaign, right? This is where oil folks go out and just try to find oil wherever they can, all throughout the Arctic, all throughout the North American Arctic. And so in July 1942, Imperial Oil, and this is a Canadian subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey, what we know today as Exxon or ExxonMobil, they began a massive state-funded well drilling program, right? So the U.S., the federal government and the military is paying Exxon basically to go in and drill in the Arctic during the war. They drilled 58 new wells at Norman Wells. And then beyond Norman, the U.S. Army signed an agreement with Imperial Oil to source an additional 20,000 barrels per day from the Northwest and initiated a sweeping geological and geophysical investigation of the entire region. And I'll go back to this map here, because if you look at the outlines, so look at this Canal Petroleum Reserve, which is basically the entire Yukon and large parts of the Northwest Territory. This is what we're talking about here. This is where a lot of this exploration is going on in order to feed the pipeline, in order to get petroleum to these infrastructures and for the American war effort. And then I'll also point out PLO 82, and this is on the North Slope of Alaska. So this was Public Land Order 82, and this is what President Roosevelt did. He withdrew the entire North Slope of Alaska for military needs, which was largely seen as petroleum, and drilling is going to occur there here, and I'll discuss that in a moment. And so while Canada established a 50-mile war zone around Norman Wells for the Canal Oil Reserve, the United States pushed and secured a more expansive 300,000 square mile zone that stretched all the way to the Alaska border. Again, all of this zone is kind of reserved for military petroleum production. In the spring of 1942, the U.S. Army Air Force conducted these vast photogrammetric surveys of the entire Mackenzie Basin, from Edmonton to the Arctic coast. And then that summer, the U.S. military even investigated the potential of getting oil from the tar sands surrounding Fort McMurray in order to fuel these military operations. Eventually, Canadian authorities took over oil exploration activities in the Northwest Territories with the goal of creating a strategic reserve. After one Canal meeting, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King wrote in his diary that, quote, "We ought to get the Americans out of the further development there and keep complete control in our hands." So there's so many different stories going on here about kind of American forcefulness and occupation, but then Canadian federal authorities trying to kind of re-exert sovereignty and make sure that they could determine the course of development. And private industry was loving this, during the war. Standard Oil of California, what we know today as Chevron, and Standard Oil of New Jersey saw far more than patriotism in assisting with the Canal project. The exigent situation gave these two oil companies a virtual carte blanche to advance their interests throughout the region and their marketing position in the post-war world. Imperial benefited from surplus equipment and drill rigs, which the U.S. government made available for wildcat drilling. The United States paid for the exploration and development of Norman Wells, but retained no ownership rights to the oil after the war. So we should talk a little bit about the actual Canal 1 pipeline. Because with no established roads, the worst winter weather in 2 decades, and soldiers shockingly ill-equipped for the ferocious climate, the project sputtered to an inauspicious start. Canal 1 ultimately proved an ecological and operational disaster, and it was only 11 months after the first oil moved through the line before it was shuttered by the United States and Canada in 1945. And a lot of this came down to environmental knowledge and expertise, right? The way that the military and its contractors understood the Arctic environment. The Southern engineers, and I don't mean like Texas and Oklahoma, but sometimes they were from there. What I mean by Southern engineers is they were not from these regions, right? They were not from Northern northern places. Their poor knowledge of the subarctic environment resulted in chronic problems and often catastrophic consequences. In disturbing the top layer of the tundra, workers created a soggy morass that consumed whole vehicles and immobilized construction equipment. Engineers then laid the pipeline directly on the ground without expansion joints or anchors, making the oil conduit vulnerable to rock slides and damage from construction vehicles, as well as thawing permafrost. The hastily built pipeline suffered leak after leak, over 100 in all. Ultimately, 1.1 million barrels of oil were shipped through the line, but only 975,000 barrels arrived in Whitehorse. While some of the undelivered barrels were used to power pump stations and construction equipment, at least 46,000 barrels of crude leaked into the terrestrial and aquatic environment during operations. After shuttering the pipeline, 50,000 barrels were just left in the line, with another 40,000 at the pump stations and oil tanks. Nearly all of this spilled into the taiga and the tundra. There were oil spills throughout the entire operation. For an example, an 80,000 barrel tank, which collapsed into the river at Norman Wells in the early winter of 1944. Journalist Philip Fradkin concluded, quote, "No energy project in the North, before or after, was built with less regard for environmental concerns," end quote. And so ultimately, it was not actually Kanawha's environmental harms that doomed the project. It was its economics and optics. After Senator Harry Truman led a Senate investigation into the project in 1943, the U.S. public came to regard Kanawha as the epitome of a wartime boondoggle. The pipeline proved more expensive than the Alaska Highway, and ultimately, get this, the costliest construction project of the entire war. With the only exception there is the Manhattan Project, right? With a cost overrun of 500 to 600%, the Norman Wells Canal 1 system produced oil at $106 per barrel, when California oil products shipped to Whitehorse cost roughly $4 per barrel. One post-mortem report on Kanawha's failure went so far as to assert that the project's, quote, waste in manpower and materials was greater than any act of sabotage by the enemy, end quote. Folks are looking for harsh reviews. It's hard to get harsher than that. The pipeline was sold for scrap and removed in the winter of 1947 and 1948. And then thanks to his standout performance criticizing Kanawha, Senator Truman became vice president, and within a year, president of the United States. The legacies of the Northwest Defense Complex are manifold. The project transformed the character, infrastructure, and post-war trajectory of the Northwest. It marked the region's ascendance as an indispensable strategic space and facilitated an intensified militarization of the North in the post-war era. According to historian P.S. Barry, the Kanawha Project, quote, overwhelmed nearly 1/5 of Canadian territory for more than 3 years, leaving a deep imprint on the life in the Northwest region and predicating a new era in continental military and economic strategy, end quote. In the wake of the Northwest Defense Complex, there were dozens of operational airfields, a new road and telephone system linking Edmonton, Whitehorse, Anchorage, and Fairbanks. The American occupation in these infrastructures also proved to be pernicious disease vectors for the region's First Peoples. And then finally, and this sets us up for the second act here, the Northwest Defense Complex changed the trajectory of oil exploration for private industry in the state in the North. Not only did the state embark on geophysical explorations and wildcat wells throughout the Arctic, the knowledge gained by these operations gave Imperial Oil and Standard Oil of California tremendous capital, opportunity, and political license to pursue corporate schemes and business opportunities in the post-war era. Thanks to clear geophysical data gained from the war effort, Imperial abandoned further exploratory drilling in the NWT, and they determined that the same kind of Devonian geological structures drilled at Norman Wells existed further to the south. And so this led to the development of the Leduc oil field in Alberta in 1947. And Imperial Oil actually bought the Canal oil refinery at Whitehorse for like pennies on the dollar and shipped it to Edmonton to profit from the Alberta oil rush. These are all ways that the state is contributing to private oil development. The project also set a new trajectory for the U.S. Military's Arctic hydrocarbon exploration beyond the war. The delays and ongoing failures of the canal system spurred military officials to find an alternative source for oil for Alaska's defense needs. They focused on the most promising oil prospect in Alaska, the Naval Petroleum Reserve number 4 on the North Slope. If we go back here, right, this is part of PLO 82, and it was set aside in the 1920s for military and naval petroleum needs. And this is a great photo here. So this is from the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. And actually, if you look very, very closely, you can see along this was the Canal 2 pipeline, which went from Skagway to Whitehorse. And even though Canal 1 was a failure, the other pipelines actually worked quite well and continued to work into the post-war era. And so we need to make a distinction here between those two pipelines. Although as I look at this photo and I look at the bottom right, it's quite dark on that pipeline, if you can see it there. And it makes me wonder if that's a small oil spill there. It would not be surprising based on the data that we have from these pipelines. So this brings me to a very fun map made in 1943. This was a survey conducted by the Alaska Bureau of Mines, who was teaming up with the U.S. military. Alaska's governor at the time, Ernest Greening, sitting in the Ernest Greening building here on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. He was very bullish about Northern petroleum development. And as the military needed oil, he partnered with the military in order to kind of prove out the reserves in Northern Alaska. So many things that I love about this map. One is it appears to be, it's very well drawn, actually, lots of great detail, but it also appears to be written on notebook paper, which is just kind of fun, but I'm sure that they use the resources available to them. And so in early 1943, with Japanese troops occupying the Aleutian Islands and engineers struggling to make progress in Canal 1, Roosevelt issued Public Land Order 82 and reserved the entire North Slope of Alaska for military petroleum exploration and development. And in the fall of 1943, this survey by the Alaska Territorial Department of Mines, they went north to figure out if there was how much oil was up there. They knew there was some oil up there. And so the fall of 1943, they were guided by a local Inupiaq, Simon Paniak from Chandler Lake. And this floatplane equipped survey spent 3 weeks investigating petroleum seeps and confirmed 5 oil flows. The survey suggested that the cost of development, including a 600-mile pipeline, compared favorably with the canal system. And so this helped to convince the Navy to spend $2.1 million on a comprehensive exploration program, and sent the Navy Seabees, these are their engineering units, north to begin drilling for oil in 1944. This is another amazing map that I love. And this map was sketched out by this gentleman by the name of Henry F. Thomas, who was both on that 1943 expedition and subsequent expeditions. And this is arguably the kind of first complete map of a proposed Trans-Alaska pipeline system, right? It's not coming from 1968, it's coming from 1946, right? Way earlier than most people have understood with the history of these infrastructures. And so it was in this context of the Navy exploring for oil on the North Slope that the Alaska Territorial Guard commenced their pipeline survey that I opened up with. Between December 1944 and March 1945, the Navy, the Alaska Territorial Guard, the Army, and civilian bush pilots investigated this route of bringing oil down from the North Slope. And based on this survey, the Navy leadership concluded that a pipeline terminating in Fairbanks, so from the North Slope to Fairbanks, could supply both military and civilian markets. And then they actually figured out that the best way to bring it to Tidewater was to continue the pipeline to Valdez. So that's exactly what we see on this map here, right? So the the Navy and the U.S. military, based on this native-led petroleum pipeline survey, recognized that a pipeline from the North Slope to Valdez made the most sense as early as 1946. And the end of the war really brought little pause to the effort to prove out this strategic petroleum reserve. The Navy recognized the long-term importance of fuel supplies in Alaska, and every generation of new military technologies required more oil than the generation before it. So in the next 8 years, military contractors and USGS scientists drilled 36 core samples and 44 test wells throughout the North Slope. By 1953, government employees and contractors had surveyed the region, photographing 290,000 square kilometers, testing oil productivity on 155,000 square kilometers, and mapping hundreds of thousands of kilometers of space. The expenditure, and through this, they discovered a 70 million barrel oil field and a number of gas fields. The expenditure of human and financial capital was at the time, according to historian Andrew Stoll, who you'll all hear from in the coming weeks, quote, the largest and most expensive research effort in Northern history, end quote. The scope and intensity of exploring PET 4, or as they called it, right, the Petroleum Reserve number 4, resulted in unprecedented environmental change and damage to the sensitive tundra. Like Canal, the Navy and its contractors had little experience operating in the far north, and their extreme environmental conditions in the North Slope constantly stymied their efforts. The Navy's 25,000-pound tracked vehicles were incessantly bogged down in the soggy tundra. The tank-like vehicles left indelible scars across hundreds of miles of tundra, some resulting in subsidence of nearly 4 meters within a year. And these tracks are still visible today. You can still see the scars from the Navy's exploration efforts all the way back in the 1940s. And so I just want to wrap up here in the next few minutes, make sure that we have time for questions. But let me just kind of explain why the importance of all of this. Early in their kind of exploration tribulations, the Navy recognized the need for Arctic environmental research. Quote, ignorance of permafrost conditions cost the United States millions of dollars during the war, argued John C. Reed. The Navy feared for another Canal 1 and enlisted science to avoid another engineering and publicity fiasco. So this is when we get the Navy supporting the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory in Barrow, today Utqiagvik. And the laboratory's Arctic research empowered its petroleum exploration throughout the 1940s and 50s and would contribute to both private oil development and the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System in the 1960s. And so by the 1950s, the Navy had spent over $50 million on efforts to drill out, try to discover oil on the North Slope. And they did discover some oil, but it wasn't enough to justify, the very high cost of a pipeline. Then Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected. He has very close ties to the oil industry. We have other folks who came up to the North Slope of Alaska during World War II, like Wallace E. Pratt. Pratt was a former vice president of the Standard Oil of New Jersey Company. He argued that the future of oil exploration was in the Arctic, but then folks like Pratt also encouraged the Navy and the federal government to get out of the way so that private industry could step in. And so basically what happens is Congress tells the Navy, stop drilling for oil. We're not going to give you any more money. The Navy pulls out. Eventually, Public Land Order 82 is rescinded in 1958. And this opens the door for private industry to come into the North Slope of Alaska. And so this really brings me to my conclusion. We have the oil industry moving north in the 1950s, thanks to things like the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry in 1951, the Suez Crisis in 1956. When the oil industry comes north, they discover large volumes of petroleum in Alaska at Swanson River. This is down south of Anchorage in 1957. And then the oil companies come up to the North Slope after it's opened in 1958. So we have Richfield, who is the company who discovered Swanson River and then would go on to discover Prudhoe Bay. When they go to the North Slope of Alaska, they literally have the U.S. Geological Survey data from the PET-4 operations in the 1950s and 60s. And they have all this Arctic environmental science that was behind the Navy's efforts. According to Marvin Magnus, who participated in these explorations and then went to work for Richfield, the data from PET-4 became indispensable for private oil exploration on the slope. Quote, the Geological Survey and the Navy Oil Unit set up all of the nomenclature and framework for the oil industry when we started taking off in the late 1950s and 1960s, he explained. And then this is great. So this comes from the BP archives, which is why there's a giant BP watermark on this. And this shows a survey by Sinclair Oil Company in 1963. If they discovered oil on the North Slope, how they would get the oil to market. And, you know, it follows those past surveys that we've already talked about. And it's a remarkably prescient and accurate route of what would become the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. There's some changes in the far north dealing with Anaktuvuk Pass, but otherwise it's very accurate between Fairbanks and Valdez. So then, of course, we have the discovery of Prudhoe Bay. And far from the beginning of North Slope development, Prudhoe Bay was the culmination of decades of state-sponsored spade work, right? Finally, I'll just say, we've got a nice photo of the coming of Prudhoe Bay here. But let me end with this. Let me end with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. On the 28th of July, 1977, the first barrel of Prudhoe Bay crude arrived at Tidewater in Valdez after flowing through the new $10 billion Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Alyeska, the pipeline's operator, and its owner companies boasted that TAPS had taken nearly 9 years and, quote, was the largest privately funded construction effort in history. While TAPS was similar to many other mega projects like the Panama Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad, Alyeska claimed that TAPS was exemplary because it was, quote, totally financed and carried out with private capital, end quote. In 1973, Congress and President Nixon approved TAPS with the justification of national security. And in the process, it killed the prospects for a Trans-Canada pipeline. There's a great map from 1971 where you can see both the proposed Trans-Alaska pipeline and the proposed Trans-Canada pipeline going across the North Slope of Alaska and down to Alberta there. The federal government permitted Alyeska priority access to supplies and materiel under the Defense Production Act of 1950, which mandated businesses prioritize contracts. And when it came to the design of the pipeline, the U.S. Geological Survey played a leading role, and much of the science and technology from the military that the military had utilized in the Arctic went into the construction of TAPS. Under the pretext of the nation's energy security, Congress barred the owners of the pipeline system from exporting their oil abroad. And the industry in the pipeline also benefited from massive direct and indirect subsidies. I won't go into all of these, but they added up to billions of dollars. The federal government also subsidized the construction of the other half of the system, the largest civilian shipbuilding program in U.S. history, 50 U.S. built, U.S. flagged, U.S. crude oil tankers. So foregrounding these neglected and hidden histories of the state in Arctic North American hydrocarbon development offers a new perspective on the timing, nature, and trajectory of these development. Despite the rhetoric of its owner companies, British Petroleum, Exxon, and Atlantic Richfield, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was never simply a private enterprise. From decades before the discovery of Prudhoe Bay, the federal government played an outsized role in the spade work of Arctic hydrocarbon development, scientific research, pipeline surveys and construction, and the production of geophysical information. TAPS was not the end result of a 9-year private effort. It was the culmination of 25 years of intensive military and corporate energies. While the U.S. government did not own or operate TAPS, it eagerly assisted in the research, construction, and financing of the system. TAPS should not be known as a private industrial project, but rather a state-sponsored project designed for private profit. Private industry stood on the shoulders of the state, but saw the Arctic hydrocarbon frontier as the selfish product of its own creation. Thank you.